Recording, and I think you can go. Thanks, Melissa.
Great, thank you, Jody. Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today during Eco3 Earth Week, which is a week-long celebration of our community's commitment to sustainability with a lineup of events, learning, and service. My name is Melissa Hong with Eco3, and I will be facilitating this webinar today. Each day this week, we will be leading a series of virtual webinars shedding light on the 4 sectors that contribute to the majority of greenhouse gas emissions in Duluth. These include food and agriculture, transportation, buildings and housing, and energy production. In developing the Duluth Citizens Climate Action Plan, it was determined that buildings and housing account for approximately 19% of Duluth's greenhouse gas emissions. And that's due to the fact that most of the buildings in Duluth they're just not efficient. As much as 80% of the energy that we produce is lost through poor building design, building practices, or just wasteful behaviors. So to reduce those emissions, the most important action that we can take is to make our buildings more energy efficient, as well as fueled by clean energy. Today, we will be joined by Jennifer Moses with City of Duluth Planning, Ben Passer with Fresh Energy, and Rachel Wagner with Green New Deal Housing. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we will hand it over to Jennifer. And did we lose her? I think we might have lost her in the meeting. I'm not seeing her name.
Yeah, we did, because it's the land of technical difficulties, we did, right as you were finishing, suddenly have like 4 people drop out, one of which is rejoined. So why don't we wait and maybe we can have Ben kick things off as we watch for Jen, hopefully, to be able to rejoin us.
That sounds good. Definitely happy to step in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Great. Is that coming through okay? You're seeing my title slide? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Jody. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Ben Passer. I'm the lead director of Energy Access and Equity at Fresh Energy. And I just want to take a quick minute to thank Melissa, Jody, and the Eco3 team for inviting me to speak. And hopefully we'll have Jen back here soon, but definitely happy to get things started. So I'll be talking about our work to center equity in residential and multifamily energy efficiency programs. So just some quick background on Fresh Energy. We're an independent energy policy nonprofit based in St. Paul, and for 28 years, we've been working at the state legislature, the Public Utilities Commission, and with state agencies and local governments to advance clean energy in Minnesota. So in my time, I'd like to start by level setting with a definition of equity, just to make sure we're all on the same page and for folks to consider throughout the conversation today. Then I'll talk a little bit about our work with our partners and why it matters, and finally discuss about how we've taken steps to advance equity in energy efficiency programs. So first, as I mentioned, just to level set, when I talk about equity in my work, I refer to it as having 2 main components. So really, we've defined equity as the elimination of barriers to full participation in the process and access to the full benefits of the outcome. And this is intentionally a broad definition that is designed to reflect the unique needs of any given individual, group, or community, and also acknowledge that fully realizing this definition of equity in practice will inherently require different levels of investment, whether that's time, outreach, and education, or financial support for certain groups, especially those who have been historically under-resourced or marginalized. So in sum, the main takeaway here is that the emphasis is on both the process and the outcome. And in both process and outcome, we know that renters in particular face a unique set of barriers. Fresh Energy is proud to be one of the co-leads of the Minnesota Multifamily Affordable Housing Energy Network. That's a mouthful to say every time, so we lovingly abbreviate it to Mama Hen. And since 2014, this network has connected the energy and housing sectors in Minnesota to break down silos in communication, address challenges, and identify solutions. Our network includes a diverse range of interests and perspectives, including utilities from across the state, energy and housing advocates, housing owners and developers, service providers, and renters. We've been really fortunate to have participation from Equilibrium 3 and Minnesota Power, to name a few. And through this network, we've been able to find numerous opportunities to expand access to energy efficiency for under-resourced Minnesotans and support stable and accessible housing in our state. And the network was built with this intentional focus on serving multifamily buildings and under-resourced households because energy efficiency in multifamily buildings is a win-win. Increased energy efficiency is one of the lowest hanging fruits to tackle high energy burdens, which, as I'll talk about in a minute, is a significant problem throughout the state. Roughly 44% of all renters are cost burdened, meaning that they spend over 30% of their income on housing costs alone, making high energy bills even harder to afford. Further, a recent study of rental households in the Twin Cities area found that under-resourced households had roughly double the energy burden of the average household. Energy efficiency also contributes to increased health and comfort, reducing potential medical expenses or costly tenant turnover. And through the long-term savings provided by energy efficiency, utility customers, whether the renter or building owner pays the bill, can not only see direct savings on utility bills, but building owners benefit from lower maintenance costs over the life of the building. To expand on the issue of statewide energy burden, or the proportion of household income that goes towards energy bills, this map comes from the U.S. Department of Energy's Low Income Energy Affordability Data, or LEAD tool. This shows that high energy burdens, those darker areas on the map, are a significant problem in every part of the state. Digging even deeper, we know that some Minnesotan households are facing even higher energy burdens. The most recent Home Energy Affordability Gap report from Roger Colton and his research team found that households below 50% of the federal poverty level are paying 33% of their income for energy costs alone. That's striking when you consider that that 33% refers solely to energy costs and doesn't factor in other basic necessities such as food, transportation, and healthcare. We also know from several recent reports, including from Rocky Mountain Institute and UCLA's Fielding School of Public Health, that that gas appliances can present dangers to public health through increased indoor and outdoor air pollution. This image is just a quick visualization of some of the common pollutants presented by gas appliances in the home, which largely align with the EPA's criteria pollutants under the Clean Air Act. It's also important to recognize that these air impacts do not affect everyone equally. As these graphics from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency show, under-resourced communities, renters, and communities of color are disproportionately exposed to higher levels of air pollution as well. The left diagram shows the aggregate relative risk level compared to the statewide average, separated by a number of identifiers. And the right diagram shows the proportion of communities that are likely to live near higher levels of air pollution, above PCA's risk guidelines. Strikingly, that's 46% of under-resourced communities and 91% of communities of color. We also know that areas of concern for environmental justice are found all across the state, as this map from the Pollution Control Agency also demonstrates. This highlights federally recognized tribal lands, areas with a substantial portion of under-resourced households, and communities of color. All of these elements are borne out in what are commonly known as the social determinants of health. According to the Minnesota Department of Health and the Pollution Control Agency, the largest contributor to overall health among these is social and economic factors, which include income, racial discrimination, transportation, and housing. One promising solution is electrifying our homes. Among other benefits, electrification can create healthier and safer homes, save money and energy in the long run through lower energy use, and improve air quality. However, given all of the considerations I mentioned earlier, It's important to recognize that not everyone has the ability to invest in these upgrades. And given our cold climate here in Minnesota, it will take major energy efficiency investments to make electrification viable. So that's something to consider going forward. And as we can construct new housing, that's a key opportunity for us to build all electric from the start. As we continue on our work on energy efficiency, I wanted to highlight some great examples from Xcel and CenterPoint Energy, as well as Minnesota Power. So one example around our work to expand access and utility programs has been our efforts working with Xcel and CenterPoint on their multifamily building efficiency program, a jointly delivered one-stop shop energy efficiency program, which works to facilitate easier access for multifamily buildings and provides options for both building owners and renters. We've also worked for several years with Minnesota Power, a great partner in our Mama Hen network. Over the course of the last few years, we've engaged with MP on their energy efficiency programs and helped to identify ways to better serve multifamily buildings in the Duluth area and throughout MP's service territory. In 2020, we were excited to see that MP proposed 2 energy efficiency programs dedicated to serving multifamily buildings. And in that same planning cycle that concluded last fall, all of Minnesota's major investor-owned utilities with substantial portions of residential customers proposed increased or expanded programs serving under-resourced households. However, we know that there's still more potential in energy efficiency in these households, and we're continuing to look at policy solutions to engage deeper investments in energy efficiency for under-resourced households. I'm nearing the end of my time, so I just wanted to shift briefly to the second part of our equity definition, process. Equity requires an inclusive and participatory process. For all of the reasons discussed earlier, all of the disproportionate impacts and inequities, it is critical for community members and impacted individuals to not just have a seat at the table or a place in the room, but to have a voice in the process. We're continually looking at ways to improve the processes that we participate in and those that we convene to make sure that these solutions work for everyone. One example to consider is called the Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership from Facilitating Power and the Movement Strategy Center. I recognize that this slide has a lot of words and different graphics on it. The report is easily accessible online, or I'm happy to share it with folks who are interested. But the gist is that this spectrum is really intended to move us from merely informing or consulting with impacted folks all the way to community-driven decision-making. I think often we tend to settle somewhere on the left side of the spectrum around gathering input with the best of intentions, but without actually embodying the full engagement that we're intending. So moving all the way to the right side of that spectrum is not easy, but again, it helps ensure that the programs and services that we seek to serve the community with are actually responsive to their needs. So again, I just wanted to provide one last reminder of our definition of equity, which includes both process and outcome. And with proper consideration of both of these components, we can help ensure that the policies and programs that we work on truly benefit all. If you're interested in staying in touch with Fresh Energy and learning more about our work, feel free to text email to the number on this slide. And that is all for me. I wanted to thank you all for your time, and I will turn it back to Melissa.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ben. Alrighty. Next, we have Jennifer Moses with City of Duluth Planning that will be presenting. Jen, you can go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay, hi everyone. I hope that this works. All of a sudden my internet decided to be really stable, of course, about 10 minutes ago. We'll share some slides here. I also have dialed in on my phone, so especially if it cuts out towards the end of my presentation, like I could still talk even if I can't share slides. So I have about 3 things that I wanted to share with everybody today. And I'm just trying to remember how to get to the slideshow. Here we go. So first thing I wanted to talk about, because we're talking about buildings and materials and how the city is working to address things related to sustainability. And when we are looking at the cities, we do have a carbon goal, and
Hey, Jen, can I
Does
interrupt for
somebody-
just 2 seconds? We are
Yeah.
seeing your presentation, but we're also seeing all of your notes. So I don't know if there's a
Mm.
different screen you need to share that might
Yeah.
make it a little bit bigger. If not, this is fine too, but just wanted to make you aware of what we were seeing.
Thank you. Of course, that's not what I saw on my monitor, but that's the way it works, right? Nope, that's still doing the same thing. Let's try this. No, that is just the way it's geared up. So
That's perfect.
I'm going to just do that.
Yep, that's perfect. That works for us.
Okay. So I want to tell everybody know that yes, we are working towards our own carbon goal, and we have a really amazing sustainability coordinator. We hired the sustainability coordinator last year, Minty Granley, and as part of the city's work on this, we are looking at where are the current greenhouse gas emissions. And so I thought that the graph on the lower right-hand corner was really telling, because as you can see, buildings take up the largest percentage of our
Okay.
greenhouse gas emission.
I hate to interrupt. We're seeing an amazing picture of the harbor,
Okay.
which I love. I think everybody loves, but
Oh boy.
these are the gremlins. Isn't it fun?
Any luck?
Thank you.
Do you see the graph?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So, like I said, the graph shows that 37% of our greenhouse gas emission comes from buildings. And this is within the city. So I'm starting off with the municipal perspective of what can the city do? And when we look at that in some different ways, see if it actually advances slides now. Great. You can see that we're looking at again at the municipal greenhouse gas emissions. The blue is buildings and fleet within the municipality. So buildings is still that large percentage. What's also interesting to me is our water and wastewater treatment has taken up a big percentage of that. And so when we think about buildings and how are we looking at the buildings within our city as a whole, it's also really interesting to think not just about the energy within the buildings, but our water use and how that relates to things like we need to pump the water. So the city has made great strides in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions due to with our water treatment and water provision, but it still does have a greenhouse gas impact. Some interesting things that the city has done. We have done a lot with energy efficiency. So reducing water loss certainly helps reduce those greenhouse gas emissions related to pumping. And it's in some ways, Duluth sees this more because we're a city on a big hill. And so to get water uphill to the buildings does require a lot of pumps. We have just slowly and surely been installing LEDs throughout city buildings. And so we've been able to see reductions with that. And looking at streetlights and traffic lights, we've been converting to LEDs. When we look at the city as a whole, so this is now stepping away from municipal city, but the city as a whole. One thing that's really telling about this slide to me is that we tend to think of greenhouse gas emissions as being largely from vehicle travel. And it is a huge chunk, but really that energy and the energy is the largest percentage. And even though it's come down, it still is the largest percentage. And again, that directly relates to buildings and being able to heat our buildings and run our buildings. We talk a lot about climate action, and the city is coming up with a climate action plan, both for municipal buildings and for the city as a whole. And one thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind that when we're looking at our building stock, part of what we want to do is definitely to mitigate this. The things on the left refer to mitigating our emissions of greenhouse gases. So anything that we can do with reducing the amount of energy needed by a building so we're not contributing as much greenhouse gas is really important. And on the other side is adaptation. So recognizing that climate change, we are facing climate change, and there are things like increased storms, increased water levels in Lake Superior, things that we will need to adapt to. The other important part of city buildings, well, not just with municipal city, but across the city of Duluth, is what might they need for adaptation. So things like having a backup source of power if your power lines snap in a big windstorm. Things like if you are in an area of rising water, do we need to bring all your mechanicals to a higher elevation so they're not going to be damaged in the case of rising water events. So those are things that we look at. And then I'm going to talk a little bit here about the Imagine Duluth 2035, our comprehensive plan that was updated in 2018. But I also wanted to show that there's so many other plans and assessments that we look to help guide what the city does overall related to climate change. So I'm going to stop my share here. I'm going to switch to look at our comprehensive plan. Because when we did our comprehensive plan in 2018, and I'm assuming everybody can see the page that says energy and conservation. So since I'm having some sharing problems, I want to double check that. So when we did our comprehensive plan in 2018, we actually included an entire chapter on energy and conservation. And this was the first time we'd done it. But all of the things that we're talking about here today are a reflection of why we knew in 2018 that it was important to talk about this in context of the city. And this really was the city as a whole. So we have a series of governing principles for energy and conservation. And what we did is we took the governing principles for the entire comprehensive plan and we selected which ones directly relate to energy and conservation. So obviously, one of them is taking sustainable actions. Another one is creating efficiencies in the delivery of public services. So anytime that we can streamline or we can make things better or easier for the city as government, that's helpful, including things like having programmable lighting or making our buildings easier to maintain in the long run. We also have our two newest governing principles, number 13, which is develop a healthy community, and number 14, integrate fairness into the fabric of the community. So Ben's presentation was kind of nice to end up going after Ben because the information in his presentation directly relate to these two governing principles, the inequity in our communities, the issues related to environmental justice, and how that relates to energy. So we talk about the cost burden for different, the cost burden for energy or the energy burden for different housing units in the city. And we talk about how renters often have a higher burden of that and how there's kind of this disconnect. The landlords don't want to invest in buildings because they don't really have the money, and then they'd have to charge more money. And if the renter is paying the utility bill, the landlord feels like they're not going to see the cost, but the renter is also going to not make a long-term investment in a building that they might only be in a couple of years. So we identified some city level actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We do talk about building energy codes and enforcement, building energy incentives. We talk about solar, and it also relates to some other areas in our comp plan, such as incorporating the importance of public transit. So there are things in our comprehensive plan that relate to other chapters and other areas of the comp plan because nothing really exists in a silo. We have another whole chapter on housing that also refers back to the energy chapter because when we're thinking about building new housing, these are all long-term things that we need to take into consideration. I'm going to skip over this, but I do want to show you this section, which was about buildings. So the other thing that we have here in Duluth is that housing stock more than most other cities in Duluth. So we have 38,000 housing units, and about half of those are more than 75 years old. So that is really significant when you think about the way buildings were built 100 years ago and the improvements that are needed in them. And because of Duluth's history our economic history and a history of population loss and job loss during decades like the 70s and 80s, we also saw that buildings during that time were not invested in the way they might have been in other cities. So we have a lot of delayed investment in buildings anyway, before you even get to talking about the energy efficiency piece. And that's a pretty big burden for homeowners and landlords, that not only do you want to improve your energy efficiency and make your buildings easier to maintain, but you also have bathrooms and kitchens that are falling apart, that are decades old. And I know that we don't have time for me to go through all of the specific recommendations in the comprehensive plan, but I wanted to show you this section, that we had the whole section that talked about the issues we're facing and the background. And then we created a set of policies, and under each of those policies, strategies that we would be working on to incorporate those. So you can see that we are talking about incentives for developers. We're talking about incentives for commercial and institution and large residential buildings. And we are talking about homeowners and landlords. So these are all pieces when we're looking at the building and materials and how they contribute to climate change and sustainability in the city. And then finally, I wanted to show a third thing. I feel like it's getting riskier and riskier. Every additional thing that I show might just cause more problems, but bear with me for 1 second.
I love planners that are willing to live on the edge.
Oh yeah, totally. This is, so you should all be seeing a screen now that says Implementation Report 2020. And of course, none of the things that I've shared are even in the same format. One was a PowerPoint, one was on a website, and one is a PDF. So really living on the edge, Jody. I'm mixing up all the different file styles. So we committed when we did the comprehensive plan that we would report every year about what we had been working on that year. We wanted it to be a plan that wasn't just sitting on a shelf. And so to do that, we create an implementation report every year, and we submit it to Planning Commission and City Council. And so if anybody is ever interested, you can scroll forward to the energy and conservation chapter. And the way that it's structured is that each of our policies are listed in a separate column. And then we talk about what we did in the past year related to that policy. And you can see we've done a lot, but we still have a long ways to go. And part of how you can see that is in these graphics at the top. So you can see the percentages, and we are trying in a qualitative way to show people here's how much progress we've made towards that goal. So this comprehensive plan was adopted in 2018. It's been 3 years. It is aiming out towards 2035. So thankfully we have some time in front of us, although of course with climate change, time is always of the essence. But we can see that we have done some things under all of the policies listed in the energy chapter. And so some of those are, we've been looking at our sustainability point standards in our zoning regulation. We have allocated some of our HUD funding towards programs that focus on energy efficiency. And so here under policy 4, Jody will appreciate the mention of Equilibrium 3. And we have done a lot of partnerships with Minnesota Power, with mayors of other cities, and looking at with our Duluth Energy Systems to increase or reduce our greenhouse gas emissions with that energy use. So there's actually 3 pages here of what we have done in 2020. So I will stop there. I know there might be some questions, and we'll turn it back to Melissa, and I'll stay around for questions at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Jen. I'm really happy that all 3 shared with no issues, or with very little issues. Lastly, for our panelists today, we have Rachel Wagner with Green New Deal Housing. And whenever you're ready, Rachel.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, and now, of course, Jen got me nervous. Hope it works. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I am incredibly happy to be third, because I feel like both Ben and Jen did wonderful jobs of setting up the content today to lead to what I'm going to talk about. So if those of you listening could imagine what taking the lessons, the principles, the priorities that Ben shared in the first round of presentation and marry that to the goals and policy approaches and municipal tactics and strategies for the city that Jen spoke about, what would you get? One thing you might get is Green New Deal housing. Green New Deal housing is a new initiative in Duluth, co-founded by myself and another local business person in town, Greg Gilbert. We're a nonprofit organization that has begun to tackle or provide a solution to the combined issues the community faces with regard to climate change, affordable housing, inequities in our community development, inequities in the process and outcomes for many of our community members with regard to access to safe housing, educational. Oops, I'm trying to advance and I'm not. No, I'm having the same. Oh, there we go. Okay. So Green Deal housing is an idea of its time that is born of the types of research and understanding of tremendous community stressors and pressures that communities all across the country are facing, and Duluth is no different. Nationwide, buildings account for about 40% of all energy consumption and CO2 emissions. It's roughly split half and half nationwide, about 20% in residential buildings and about 19% in commercial buildings. The mix sounds like it's slightly different, but not much different in Duluth. So roughly a fifth or a little more, between a fifth and a quarter of all energy consumption and all associated CO2 emissions are contributed from housing. And so I'm going to talk specifically about housing and not buildings in general, but I want to start with this slide and talk about the many elements within the built environment that not only contribute to climate change and general environmental well-being, but that really point to measures of disparity and inequity. And again, like the state of Minnesota, like much of the country, Duluth is no different. In fact, the disparities in outcomes in Duluth, if you are poor or a person of color, are actually worse than in many other parts of the state with regard to income, familial wealth, quality of your housing, reliability of the safety of your water, access to food, and very importantly, your ability to respond to stressors, a power outage, the loss of a job, illness within your family, a pandemic. So Green New Deal Housing is a new organization with the mission to develop equitable zero energy housing and a green collar workforce in the Arrowhead region. We share exactly the definition that Ben Passer put forward about equity. Our organization seeks to create the programs, policies, and priorities for ourselves inclusively at the sort of ground level of creating these programs so that both the process and the outcomes of what we aim to do can be equitable. And again, in agreement with what Ben said, this means that we invest our resources, attention, and energy to the areas and people of the greatest need. And it's important to recognize that equitable and equal have different, and very importantly, different meanings. So 3 elements are going to be focusing the work of Green New Deal Housing, our organization. I mentioned earlier about the relationship between buildings and climate change. We cannot mitigate climate change without transforming our housing. But we also can't transform our housing without transforming the building trades. These are both opportunities for equitable investment in our community to create all electric, zero energy homes powered by renewable energy systems, to train the workforce to help to build and increase widespread adoption of these practices, and to work with existing organizations and stakeholders on these efforts so that we are transforming the community widespread into resilient, sustainable, equitable places of stability. And I think it's worth taking a moment after the events of yesterday in Minneapolis to express the importance and the gratitude of partnership, public engagement, activism, and the desire not just to reach equity across the board on so many of these issues, but also the importance of how equitable actions, equitable policies, equitable institutions, and reversing the historic injustices of the past and present lead to, or can lead to, community-wide stability in a moment, and hopefully for a generation and beyond. Very briefly, a definition of zero net energy is that when the total amount of energy consumed in a year by a building is less than or equal to the total amount of energy generated by renewable energy systems on site during that year. So Green New Deal housing is in the business of developing zero net energy homes. That means super efficient homes that are powered by clean energy, all electric homes with an on-site renewable energy system sized for that home. So these houses, this type of housing isn't new in the United States. It isn't new in Duluth. There are zero net energy homes in Duluth, but most of them were custom homes designed one at a time for a client who could afford the services of an architect and a custom home. But we have the knowledge and we have the technology to make every new building zero net energy if we decide to do so. One of the ways that we decide to do this is to educate all of the stakeholders and building trades about how to do this, the importance of doing this. One of the ways that we can speed up a transition like this with regard to housing, and this is the approach that we are taking at Green New Deal Housing, is to look at mechanisms for widespread adoption and widespread production of new homes under the lens or through the lens of standardization. But with our lens of standardization, we are looking at zero energy and determining what do we need to do, what can we do to standardize for cost effectiveness, widespread adoption, and understandability to get to zero net energy. And we spent the better part of a year studying this and putting together a suite of details, specifications, and vetted assemblies that are not too far beyond what is already familiar to the building trades. We have created standardized details for foundations, exterior walls, window installation, roof assemblies, porches and overhangs, air sealing details, mechanical systems and specifications, and even some standardization specifications for what I call site orientation limits, recognizing that if you want to try to standardize a process and standardize, for instance, a set of house designs, you have to find some way of accounting for the compass, because you can't take a solar optimized space plan and take what is shown as the south facing wall on the plan and plop it down on any building site and inadvertently put the south facing wall facing north, the house will not perform as intended if you do that. So we have that within our standardized approach in addition. This slide is intended to show the general public what the approach to standardization for a Green New Deal home looks like. I don't have time today to go through all of it, but we will make these slides available afterwards. And this diagram is also available on the Green New Deal Housing website. It's also in large format right now at the Duluth Folk School at the Green New Deal Housing Show and Tell exhibit. This diagram does two things, though. It not only shows the public, conveys what an approach to standardization for a zero net energy home in a cold climate looks like and contains, but it is the first tool of many that we are developing for both public engagement and for workforce training. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So I mentioned before the issue of the compass and the ability to standardize site orientation. We do this with notes in multiple places on our sets of plans, which says the north arrow on this plan matters. In order to perform as intended, this plan needs to be within 30 degrees of site south. The houses that we're designing are relatively small, but they're not tiny homes, although a tiny home is on the to-do list for Green New Deal housing because it has been pretty heavily requested, as are duplexes and perhaps eventually larger multifamily buildings. But we're a new organization. Right now we're focused on modestly sized single-family homes intended to go both on infill lots within any city or municipality, but also that can be clustered together on slightly larger sites to create sort of smaller mini developments or communities. So what does a Green New Deal home that's solar optimized look like? How does it sort of appear? Probably like a lot of houses that people in Duluth are used to seeing. Pitched roofs make sense in cold climates because they shed snow. Pitched roofs are a great place to put a solar PV array. And roofs and other overhangs are great ways to manage the passive solar gain so that the sun enters the house in the wintertime when you want it to help warm the house, but the higher angle of the sun in the summertime is blocked by the overhangs so that you don't overheat the home and do not need to rely on excessive air conditioning. These houses are designed with best practices with regard to spatial layout, understanding of sort of flexibility in floor plans for folks, durable materials, and again, as Ben and Jen both spoke about, minimal pollutants. Also easy to operate and relatively easy to build so that there isn't anything overwhelmingly exotic or unfamiliar about them. And this leads to the last section of the presentation, which is about the job training and workforce development. We have a shortage of people entering the building trades in Duluth and in Minnesota as a whole. We also have an aging workforce. They are retiring at a faster rate than we are bringing in new workers. And so efforts in workforce development are really needed. And this is a perfect moment to shift the way that we train the incoming workforce so that they are ready to build the way that we need to be building in order to address climate change, both mitigation and adaptation and resiliency. There's another silver lining to this, and that is the next generation is more aware and committed to living differently with regard to both ecology and equity than probably anything we've seen since the 60s. And so we are at this moment of being able to offer training for free, offer training in green construction practices, offer training to our existing workforce as well. We call it building skill sets and changing mindsets when we're talking about our existing workforce. And we think we are at a moment where we can make a pretty major transformation in our community and beyond with the adoption both of the approach to build zero net energy homes for all income levels, build this green workforce so that they can take those skills and trades into all new residential building, and create an equitable community with good, stable jobs and skill sets that are needed as we move forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our presenters. I love how Melissa, as she's put together these panels, have been able to bring, really a consistency of story, and yet from so many different points of view, from that city view of planning to tackling, even really from the state view, things like multifamily. How do we address housing with that eye, even with renters? And then, of course, now with the Green New Deal housing and the work that Rachel is involved in. I'd like to encourage you, we will at the end of the presentation today at 1 o'clock, actually have about a 15-minute kind of question and answer section. So we'd invite you to stick around for that, and you can ask questions just via voice. But if you have some other observations or questions, we do also invite you to use the chat box. What I'd like to do is kind of ask our panelists a question we've been kind of carrying throughout this week. And that is that when you look at all of the challenges that we have on climate, on equity, on differences from home ownership to what type of housing, and even some of kind of our health disparities, all of those things, the big challenges that are out there, what are the things that right now give you the most hope? And maybe we'll start with Ben again.
Thanks, Jody. It's a good question. It's a big question. I think, just to maybe build upon where I think Rachel ended her presentation, I think a lot of what gives me hope is how many folks are just really working actively on the issues in front of us right now. And I think, I've been really fortunate that I went to law school here in St. Paul and have worked at Fresh Energy for 6 years since graduating from law school, and I've just been able to see, in that time, how pressing and how important these issues are to so many different individuals and organizations, and just folks in our community. And I've just really been fortunate to that this is the environment that I've landed in, that I've been able to work in, and call my work and my passion every day. And so I think it's that really gives me hope that there are so many of us who just come into this work every day, and really recognize we need each other to find the solutions that we need, and also that it is about that intentionality. It's about really working actively to address those things that are ahead of us, and just really being intentional about making sure that we're all part of that solution.
Great. Jen, let's kick it over to you.
Sure. I almost hesitate to make too much of a political statement, but I'm going to think about politics for a second, because of course, working for the city, we do work a lot with politics. And I will say that Mayor Larson has made it a very big part of her tenure at the city to set very ambitious goals related to climate change and related to equity. And I've been really just happy and thrilled to work under the administration where I know that these are important. And it gives me hope then to see those be implemented. So the hiring of a sustainability coordinator, the creation of an energy plan commission at the city. And some of the graphs, you could see some of the things that the city has done to actively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as with anything, it feels really good to see progress. And so if you start making progress in the right direction, it's easier to have hope that you can continue to make progress. And also our city council, they recently just declared a climate emergency, and seeing our city council and our leaders want to create momentum in that direction gives me hope. And finally, Rachel, I just want to say that I really was excited about your presentation and understanding what you're doing with Green New Deal homes. And so because, I'm a person that is always on the fly and always thinking of things, like I picked up my phone, I texted our housing team lead because I think there's so many things that overlap here. So yes, it's about energy, but we also are in a city where we need more housing, and we need housing for everybody. And so it's exciting to be in a place where there's so many players that could potentially be at the table.
Great. And Rachel, you kind of ended with a lot of the hope that you're seeing with the youngins, et cetera, but I'd love to hear more.
Well, I will expand on that because that is precisely what gives me hope right now. Or I'll say twofold. It isn't only the young. One is the energy, no pun intended, and persistence and courage of the younger generation in building and sustaining movements around environmental and economic and racial justice. That, I would say, gives me more hope than anything. And as somebody of a generation prior to them, I am not about to slow down when I see what the younger generation is doing, because I have no right to. It's my job, my duty, my responsibility to keep pace with them as best I can and be beside them. And I guess the second piece of hope, which is sort of a corollary to that, is I have been invited through more doors in the last 2 years. And more than one of those years was during a pandemic, than I have in most of my career as a designer. And that's because I'm knocking on different doors. And I am so excited and motivated by the grassroots efforts and the multidisciplinary efforts and the abilities of folks to move across and in between sectors, because that's exactly what we need in order to solve problems. We're not going to solve them from silos.
Great, thank you. I do have to say, as we put these presentations together, we try to listen really hard, and every once in a while, I even have to listen to myself, and I have to just announce to everyone I just officially passed the age barrier, because I just heard myself refer to people as youngins. So we have been very excited at Equilibrium 3 to work with a whole bunch of youngins, I guess, over the years through our AmeriCorps Vista program, some of which have been working on programs and projects, for example, putting in the solar garden here in Lincoln Park, as well as working with Green New Deal housing, working with the city's sustainability office, and working on energy policy. So I say youngins, but I say it with about as much respect and love as somebody can. in kind of our last few minutes here, can I give just a real kind of quick lightning round, maybe a minute or so, from each of you? Is you have an audience here. This is being recorded. We've got lots of people attending today, and thank you for that attendance. And we will also be having this available online, etc. What's the one thing that you would ask of others to get involved and address climate? Where do you think there are these opportunities to engage and make a difference? And maybe we'll just kind of let you guys pop up. I won't pick on anybody in particular.
I'll jump right in with my first answer, which is just communicate with everybody that you can. I do think that, you know, if you're talking to a group of your peers and they see that you have ideas, you have strategies, you have things you want to talk about, and that, you know, that it's sort of peer pressure in reverse, right? I think that it's really just an important topic to continue to bring up, and talk to your city councilors, talk to your mayor, talk to all of your elected leaders. And if it's you are at Menards and you realize they don't have these materials that you want to retrofit something that's important, you know, communicate to them. Whatever the company is that's not providing a product that you think would be important, communicate to them as well.
I'll build on that because I think Jen and I had very similar thoughts here, but slightly different frame. But I would just say that decision makers are everywhere, and you know, I think everyone has a role to play in how those decisions are made. So you know, I think to build on what Jen said, you know, communicate on your your consumer choices, and you know, if there are ways to influence those consumer choices, you know, definitely take advantage of that. Communicate with your local decision makers, state decision makers in various venues, and make sure your voice is heard. But then also, you know, there's those kind of non-traditional decision-making spaces. You know, your energy providers are decision makers, and you can, you know, communicate to your energy providers on what you as an energy consumer want to see and what you want our future to be. And so I think, you know, similar to what Jen said, but maybe just a slightly different frame, decision makers are everywhere, and we have an opportunity, and I would say an obligation, to help influence how those decisions are made.
Yeah, so Ben and Jen stole everything I was going to say. So I'll see if I can add something here of use. I guess I will add one thing which builds on it. And I would say to everybody, choose something, and then stick with it. Don't make it intermittent. Don't make it something that you maybe pay attention to once a year. Make it manageable, but make it big. And so I'm not talking about changing your light bulbs, and I'm not talking about recycling more, because those are not the actions that are going to move a society forward in the direction and at the pace that we need to move. So choose your action accordingly, in line with the magnitude of the problem and the magnitude of the effort that we all need to make.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you for presenting today, and those that have attended. Tomorrow, we do have Mindy Granley, kind of from the city of Duluth, who's going to be sharing her vision. It's very exciting, as Jen mentioned, that we do have a sustainability officer now with the city. And then on Friday, we'll be having a session on energy production with State Senator Jen McEwen, Reamp, Gail Francis, and one of my favorite people, Solar Bear. And so right now, I'd love to hand it back to Melissa to facilitate question and answers. Thank you all.
Great, thanks so much, Jody. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone again for being able to join us today. At this time, it is 1 o'clock, so we will be officially ending the meeting, but we will be on for an optional 15-minute Q&A with panelists for any folks interested in sticking around. Let me just